Hello YouTube! In the year 176 of the 4th Era, the direct aftermath of Tamriel's Great War between the Cyrodiilic Empire and the Altmerry Dominion, there was a conflict brewing in the Reach region of the Imperial province of Skyrim, which would define the province's future for the decades to come, as both the Forsworn guerrilla forces and the Stormcloaks, who would later go on to plunge Skyrim into civil war, would find their origin. Now, today we're examining the Markarth incident, the conflict that started it all. So, observant viewers will know that I've already covered the Markarth incident in the past, however that video has officially become outdated last year as Bethesda and Modiphius released their official Skyrim board game, which contains some all new Elder Scrolls stories. More info about that game at the end of the video. Anyway, one of these stories takes place 25 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the video game, right in the middle of the Markarth incident, and it just so happens that the board game gives us an opportunity to interact with some of the big players of the conflict while the conflict is going down, and it provides us with some significant new information about the conflict, which I aim to cover here today. So let me paint you a picture. It's the year 174 of the 4th Era. The Empire recalls all the troops it can from every corner of the Empire to help with their final assault, aimed to take back the Empire's heartland and the capital from the hands of the Altmerry Dominion, who managed to take it over, together with significant other strategic positions in Cyrodiil just the last few years. Now, the Empire gambles everything on this assault, leaving every city and town which isn't on the front lines with nothing more than a bare-bones defensive force to defend it. This is the situation that the Reachmen saw happening right in front of their eyes. Now, these Reachmen are some of the inhabitants of this region, dubbed the Reach, which spans across parts of Skyrim, Hammerfell and High Rock, with Markarth as its capital. These Reachmen are a quite ancient people, with an ancient and very peculiar culture. They do not worship the same gods as the surrounding peoples and have wildly different customs. They kind of look like the Bretons of High Rock, but they claim themselves to be a fully separate people, and while throughout history they've had their own kingdoms and even ruled the Cyrodiilic Empire for a bit during the Second Era in what was known as the Longhouse Dynasty, for large parts of history, especially recent Tamrielic history, they haven't been able to rule themselves or the land that they consider theirs. Rather, they've often lived under the rule of the Nords, as part of the Reach became one of Skyrim's 9 holds, ruled over by a Nordic Jarl. Now, the treatment of the Reachmen has varied throughout history, depending on the Jarls, but only very rarely did the Reachmen enjoy the same social status as the Nords, and rarely were they part of the ruling class. And now, while the Empire is at war, they recall most of their soldiers from the Reach and leave its capital, Markarth, practically undefended. The Reachmen, under their then leader, a man named Medanek, decided to attack the city of Markarth and take control over the hold, taking advantage of its light defenses. Now, Medanek then proclaimed himself King of the Reach and declared it independent from Skyrim. And I say from Skyrim since he did not declare the Reach independent from the Empire, as according to Imperial documents, one of the first things that King Medanek did was send emissaries to the Emperor, hoping to have the Reach be recognized as its own Imperial province rather than it being part of Skyrim. Now, this proposal was apparently under serious Imperial consideration, although the Emperor was too busy with organizing an attack on the Heartland to enter into deep negotiations at the time, so official certification would have to wait until after the war. However, what follows now is a deeply controversial part of history, as both sides of the conflict tell a different tale, and while I personally feel strongly that one side of the story is most likely, my original video was criticized for leaning too heavily to one side, so I'll first explain both sides and then at the end give you my own verdict. So there are conflicting accounts about the period starting in the year 174 when Medadek's Reachmen rule started in the city to the year 177 when the conflict had completely ended. The first conflicting story concerns the state of Medanek's rule. Now, both Imperial documentation from at the time and Forsworn in Skyrim claim that his rule was relatively stable and relatively forgiving to the Nords they ousted from power. These sources claim that Medanek permitted Nords to stay in the city and continue their lives as normal as long as they surrendered to the new government. Only the worst Nord landowners who had exploited and mistreated their Reachmen servants were killed, and life in and around Markarth continued mostly as it had been, just under new management. Now, the other side of the coin here is the Nordic argument, and I'm specifically not saying the Stormcloak argument, since the Imperial sympathetic Jarl of Markarth makes these claims as well, next to Stormcloak supporters, so this is the Nordic side of the coin, while the previous argument is the Reachmen and Imperial side of the coin. You see, the Nords claim that the Reachmen violently took the city, with their 2-year rule being a period of chaos and violence against the Nords, with the Nords being discriminated against and the Reachmen refusing cooperation with the Nordic community leaders. Something interesting here is that when we visit Markarth and speak to King Medenac during his rule while we are playing the Skyrim board game, I get the impression that the Reachmen side of the argument is closer to the truth. You see, in the board game you play as a group of political dissidents of the Blades organization, who are then outlawed by the treaty which ended the Great War, and thus they are being hunted by the Thalmor. Now, you can approach King Medenac in the game, asking him to provide for a safe haven for you and your people, and he is very willing to give amnesty to dissident Blades, if you help him with something, of course. That something being guiding his bard Azadel to perform his leap of faith. Yeah, that guy we meet in Skyrim. So, to me it seems that the Reachmen kingdom was a bit more civilized and less chaotic than the Nordic perspective seems to offer. Although I admit that the board game only gives a small glimpse in the goings on in the city and doesn't particularly go into any kind of violence against the Nords, so I admit it doesn't definitively rule out the Nordic perspective. Alright, well, eventually the Great War ended and the White Gold Concordat Treaty was signed, and many Nordic soldiers returned home after fighting in Cyrodiil. Now, the White Gold Concordat, the treaty which had ended the war, had as one of its provisions that the worship of Talos, the god of humankind, would be outlawed in the Empire. This was one of its many provisions, and I highly recommend checking out my video analyzing the White Gold Concordat if you want to know more. I'll put it in the description together with my video covering the Great War, in case you need a refresher on some of the details on Tamriel's greater geopolitical situation at the time. Now, this outlaw of Talos worship proved to be quite controversial, but it wasn't necessarily noticed by many Nords, as while temples were closed, behind closed doors everybody just simply continued to worship, so most people didn't really mind too much at the time. That being said, there was one particular person who did very much mind. A young Imperial officer returning from Cyrodiil, the son of the Jarl of Eastmarch. The person I'm talking about, of course, is Ulfric. Ulfric hated the ban on Talos worship. He saw the god's worship as central to Nordic culture and therefore was willing to fight for it. But his father in Eastmarch likely wasn't willing to give in to his demand to legalize worship and thus started a conflict with the Empire. But there was one man who was willing to give Ulfric a place to worship. This man, Jarl Rolfdir of Markarth, the father of Jarl Igmund of Markarth, whom we meet in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim video game. Now, Jarl Rolfdir was living in exile at the moment after being ousted from his own city by Medenac, and he promised Ulfric that if he and his men helped him retake the Reach, he officially reinstate Talos worship in the Reach, against the terms of the White Gold Concordat and against the Empire's laws. Ulfric then travelled across the land, amassing a militia of disillusioned war veterans, travelling through Eastmarch, Winterhold, the Pale and Whiterun and then the Reach. He and his militia took back the city and killed and imprisoned the Reachmen leaders and killed or drove out their warriors, forcing the survivors into the hills and the mountains of the Reach. These Reachmen in exile would from that moment on call themselves the Forsworn and enact guerrilla warfare against anyone in the Reach, both Imperial troops and Nords, as revenge for their ousting from the city. While most Reachmen leaders were killed, their former king Medenac was actually imprisoned instead of killed at the specific request of the Silverblood family, Markarth's most influential and richest family, as they hoped that they would be able to control and use the Forsworn guerrillas in the mountains for their own objectives if they controlled their king by having him in a prison that they owned. Now, this would ultimately lead to the Forsworn conspiracy quest in Skyrim and the subsequent escape from Sitna Mine quest, where one can choose to either kill King Medenac or help him escape the prison and further his cause. However, what matters here is that the Reachmen claim that the Nords took back the city in an unnecessarily brutal way, that Jarl Rolfdir, with Ulfric's help, put down and killed or imprisoned anyone who had even talked to Medenac or had spoken his name, and killed and tortured the family members and even children of those who they thought were against their rule or had collaborated with Medenac. Some pro-Imperial sources even claim that Ulfric himself slaughtered all those in the city who did not join him in his fight, as he and his militia breached the gates, but that's likely Imperial propaganda distributed during the Civil War 25 years later. But it is clear that a lot of blood was spilled and many innocents were killed while Jarl Hrolfdir and Ulfric took back the city, as the stories of Reachman survivors from that period all tell similar stories. Although we are a bit fuzzy here on the timeline, as it's also a possibility, and I'm going into theory here, that things only got truly violent against the Reachmen after Jarl Hrolfdir had been assassinated while attempting peace talks with the Reachmen in the mountains, after he took back his city. You see, in Skyrim we have already learned that Jarl Hrolfdir went to negotiate with the Reachmen after taking back his city, and was then assassinated. But you see, I think it's very unlikely that Jarl Hrolfdir and Ulfric would have used that much unnecessary cruelty if they intended to negotiate a peace with the Reachmen after taking back the city. And that was their intent, as Jarl Hrolfdir went into the mountains to negotiate with the guerrilla troops. It would be very, very stupid to be brutal against the friends and families of those people you want to negotiate with before going to the negotiation. That's something you do after if it fails. Now, the Jarl never left that negotiation meeting, as he was murdered there, and it would be logical that his son, the now Jarl Igmund of Markarth, would initiate violence against the Reachmen for retribution for his father's death. However, now we enter a really interesting part of the history, a part that we only learned of recently through the Skyrim board game, which, just to remind you guys, was completely vetted by Bethesda Game Studios' writers in terms of story. I interviewed their lead writer, and I'll put a link into the interview in the description, and he confirmed to me that Bethesda greenlit and examined the entire story and even suggested additions and those kind of things. So I consider it canon since it comes partially from their writers and was completely cleared by their writers. Anyway, you see, Jarl Hrolfdir was marked for death by the Dark Brotherhood at this time. Someone put a contract on his head. I asked the writers of the board game who put the contract on the Jarl's head, as I was allowed to ask some questions after going through the game, but they specifically told me that Bethesda did not allow them to tell anyone who put that contract on the Jarl's head, so that's interesting to say the least. This is one of the biggest mysteries added by the board game, since I personally think that this means that someone from the outside used the Dark Brotherhood's assassins to sow more chaos in Markarth and deliberately caused a slaughter of Forsworn remaining in the city, who were likely killed in retribution for the Jarl's death. This makes each side of the story make sense, as the Nords claimed that they did not use violence when entering the city, while the Forsworn claimed that they violently killed many Reachmen once they were in the city. If of course you buy into my theory that some of the propaganda from each side deliberately changed the timescale they try to use to legitimize their own cause, which in my opinion wouldn't be the craziest idea in the world. Anyway, the major question remains, who put the contract on Jarl Hrolfdir's head? Well, I have two theories, although please let me know your theories in the comments, because I have no idea. Bethesda themselves refuses to confirm who it was. So my first theory is quite boring. It could have been the Thalmor, whose whole objective is to cause chaos in the Empire and make it weaker, and I mean, this definitely hit the mark. But I do have another theory, one I personally buy into more, and the longer I think about it, the more likely this theory gets. Now, I personally think that Ulfric, or at least one of his most loyal men who escaped the city, ordered the hit on Jarl Hrolfdir. You see, soon after Ulfric helped take back the city and Talos worship was legalized in the Reach by Jarl Hrolfdir, the Imperial Legion showed up at the gates of Markarth and they were like, "Hey man, thanks for taking back the city, will you let us in?" And Ulfric told them, "Yes, definitely, but you have to allow Talos worship to continue here, otherwise we'll fight you off as well and make ourselves independent here in the Reach." So reluctantly the Imperial General, or the Legate, who was at the scene at the time, without asking anyone from higher up, said, "Okay, sure, no big deal," actively breaking the peace treaty which had ended the war barely a year after it had been signed. But it very much was a big deal, and it didn't take long before the Thalmor found out that the Empire broke the peace treaty already by allowing Talos worship in the Reach. The Thalmor then presented the Emperor with an ultimatum. Put down Talos worship in the Reach or resume the Great War with the Dominion. Faced with little choice, the Emperor ordered the arrest of Ulfric and his men. They were lifted from their beds and put into prison, as Talos worship was once more outlawed in the Reach, and the Empire was forced to actively start clamping down on Talos worship across the province. Not only that, this incident caused the Thalmor to demand access to Skyrim with their justiciars in order to look for Talos worshippers themselves, as it was clear that the Empire was not upholding their treaty obligations in the province. This means that Ulfric's insistence to have free Talos worship led to the coming of the Justiciars to Skyrim and the following persecution of Talos worshippers, where the Nords at first were just able to worship behind closed doors without anyone really caring. Ulfric forced the Empire's hand to allow the Thalmor in and start their heavy prosecution. However, the arrest of Ulfric and his loyal men, while Jarl Hrolfdir managed to stay on as Jarl, must have been seen as a betrayal by Ulfric and his men, so that's why I think it's either Ulfric or one of his men who put the Dark Brotherhood contract on Jarl Hrolfdir's head. And let's be honest, it's likely one of Ulfric's men and not him himself. Which in turn means that, if I got the timeline right, they were in turn the root cause for the retribution killings of many remaining Reachmen in the city, but that timeline, like I said, is my personal theory, if you buy into the fact that Jarl Hrolfdir's killing cost for the retribution against the Reachmen. Anyway, eventually Ulfric would be set free and would become the Jarl of Eastmarch and would eventually go on to start the Skyrim Civil War, while the Forsworn would continue their guerrilla warfare against any non-Reachmen in the Reach. As you can see, the Markarth incident was an essential event in setting up the situation as we find it in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and is an essential piece in understanding the political situation of the province, and it's even an event used in the propaganda of both the Imperials and the Stormcloak side of the war, and it's at the root of the Forsworn guerrilla rebellion happening in the Reach as we play the game. So I truly hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new about the incident today. Now, if you did, please consider returning to the channel for the next Elder Scrolls lore video, or watch some of my old ones. Also, please let me know in the comments who you think contracted the Dark Brotherhood to take out Jarl Hrolfdir, as that is one of the biggest remaining mysteries of the incident and isn't talked about enough, as it's a very recent addition to the lore that not many people have seen, but one that was greenlit by Bethesda themselves and is in an official Bethesda licensed release, so yeah, it's worth discussing. That being said, short about the board game, I included a link to it in the description. It's very fun to play with friends, it takes a bit long to play, but yeah, it really plays as if Skyrim was a board game, so I can really recommend checking it out. Modiphius gave me a free copy to cover the main stories of the game, and I'm almost done with my video on the second main story which is included in the game, so keep watching out for that. And yeah, I know I got it for free, but honestly I couldn't recommend it more even if I didn't, because it's pretty fun as a board game. I can really recommend playing it with friends though, since alone it's possible to play, but I really recommend making 2 characters then, since otherwise some of the battles in the game are pretty hard, and like me, you might get persuaded by yourself to cheat. Anyway, what rests me now is to thank my top Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polarized Putin, Athena Hyodis, Volcure of Argonia, King Chris, Bulge, Scribe of the Scrolls, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Zarmekal and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel stays alive, and for that I'm very grateful. That said, I hope to see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.